Hi guys, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the true crime podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse and shining a harsh spotlight on the parents, guardians, and caretakers who silenced them. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 3, Zamir Perkins. A little housekeeping up front. This episode will be a little shorter than the last two, but that's just because there was a lot less information available online about this one, and it was next to impossible to find audio or video clips from the trial. I'm going to aim to keep each episode between, say, 45 minutes to an hour for consistency's sake. Before I get started on today's case, I wanted to give a quick update on the case of AJ Frund, who I covered in episode 1. That is the sound of the house at 94 Dole Street in Crystal Lake, Illinois, where AJ was murdered, being demolished on Wednesday, March 4th, 2020. Neighbors and community members lined the street to watch the House of Horrors come down and to honor 5-year-old AJ's memory. AJ's mother, Joanne Cunningham, pled guilty to his murder in December, and this week her sentencing was set. It will take place on April 30th, 2020. His father, Drew Frund, stood in front of the same judge this week and waived his right to a jury trial, requesting instead a bench trial, which means a judge alone will be responsible for deciding whether or not Drew is guilty. His lawyer, Henry Sugden, has said they are still trying to come to a satisfactory plea deal, but one has not yet been agreed upon. I'll keep you posted about future updates, both on the podcast and on sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. And now it's time to tell you another tragic story, this one about an adorable 6-year-old boy from Harlem named Zamir Perkins. My sources for today's episode were People, The New York Times, The New York Daily News, NBC New York, The New York Post, The Daily Mail, The Sun, The World Times News, Politico, and DNA Info. I first covered Zamir's story on the blog on January 20th of 2020. This one is extremely brutal, and that's saying a lot considering the details of the cases I cover. Imagine you're a 26-year-old single mom living in New York City with your precious 6-year-old son and your handsome, muscular 42-year-old boyfriend with whom you're head over heels infatuated. Sounds pretty good so far, right? Now, imagine your boyfriend is abusive to your son. Okay, maybe that's not so great. And now, imagine the big, beefy stud you've moved in with is all about torturing your child to the point where he essentially waterboards your sweet little boy in an ice-cold shower, beats him to the brink of death with a splintered broomstick, and hangs him from a wall hook in your squalid Harlem apartment before casually going out for breakfast, leaving your son to die. What would you do? Well, if you were Geraldine Perkins, you'd spend several hours cleaning the squalid apartment, maybe read the Bible, bathe your son's lifeless body, fix your makeup, and put on a wig, and then you'd take your 6-year-old son to Mount Sinai St. Luke's Hospital, where he would be pronounced dead. The situation I just described is unfortunately not hypothetical. The horrific case unfolded in January of 2020, as now 45-year-old Rysheim Smith faced multiple charges related to the brutal death of his girlfriend's son, 6-year-old Zamir Perkins, in 2016. Geraldine and Rysheim's relationship began when they met in May of 2015. She ran into him on the street while walking back to Hamilton Place, a shelter for battered women where she and her son were staying in Harlem. The tall, well-built, handsome man who asked for her number was college-educated, muscular, and almost twice her age. While behind bars at Rikers Island in 2016, Geraldine told a reporter, "I wish I would have known. I wish I would have known he was no good."
I just want everybody in the world to know that, my father was a good man. He treated these kids right, and I just wish that, the truth would come out.
That would never be my stepfather at all. And right now I'm shaking because it's not him. And I don't know why they're betraying him to be a monster, and he's not. He loved kids.
Rysheim, Geraldine said, promised to look after her and Zamir, who was affectionately known to family members as Zai. In June of 2015, she and her son moved into Rysheim's apartment, which it turned out he was illegally squatting in and did not have electricity other than that which he funneled into the apartment via an extension cord plugged in elsewhere. After Zymer's death, investigators discovered rotting food in the refrigerator, a great deal of mold, rust, and mildew in the bathroom, filth all over the apartment, maggots in the carpet, and a cockroach infestation. After only a short time living together, Geraldine said, Rysheim began to frighten her. Claiming Rysheim was abusive, Geraldine said, I didn't know how to leave. In her jailhouse interview, she claimed that aside from a spanking here and there, she never saw Rysheim hurt little Zamir before September 26, 2016. She said she knew nothing about her son's broken ribs, which had already healed. She also said the bruises covering his lifeless body were caused by him being a little boy who fell down a lot while playing. That's not quite what she told investigators immediately after Zymer's death, however. She told police she saw Rysheim beat Zymere multiple times with closed fists, open hands, broomsticks, a shower rod, and other objects. She also reported seeing her boyfriend grab Zamir by the throat. A preliminary autopsy showed Zamir was malnourished. Geraldine, however, said the boy was always eating but, like herself and his biological father, was genetically skinny. The official autopsy, performed by New York City Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Susan Ely, revealed a bounty of horrifying details. Zamir had multiple bruises on his torso, at least 30 fractured ribs that had healed, bruises and finger marks on his neck, and other injuries, including a contusion on his head, which was likely caused by a blow from the shower rod. Dr. Ely told the court, quote, he had, in his case, multiple bruises and scrapes on the outside of his body and a laceration. They ranged from his head, his face, his trunk, his arms, and legs. End quote. Zamir, at the age of 6, was 3 feet 6 inches tall and weighed a mere 35 pounds when he died. That is the average size of a 4-year-old boy. Both Rysheim and Geraldine were arrested and charged in connection with Zymer's death. It turned out Geraldine and Zamir were in contact with the Administration of Children's Services, or ACS, from the time he was born on June 21, 2010, which was the same month Geraldine graduated from high school. Right after Zymer's birth, traces of marijuana were found in Geraldine's system, but the baby did not test positive for the substance. The final incident came when staff at Zamir's school made a report that led to further ACS involvement after Zamir limped into school on April 19, 2015, complaining of leg pain. Elizabeth Garcia, the school nurse, testified that Zamir had oval-shaped bruises on his inner thighs. She said in court, quote, they were like when a child is hit with a belt, end quote. Because of this report, Zamir was evaluated at the Child Advocacy Center in Manhattan, and in addition to ACS, the New York Police Department, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and Safe Horizons, a social work organization, were also involved. Zamir was not removed from his mother's custody, and Geraldine was not arrested or charged. The Daily Mail released a short video clip showing Zamir speaking briefly with an ACS caseworker and playing with Play-Doh. This video was also shown to jurors. Listening to his little voice, it really hits home how tiny and young Zamir was, and how vulnerable he was to the monstrous adults in his life.
Okay, I have some Play-Doh. You like Play-Doh? I have some Play-Dohs in here. And some markers and paper. Do you like to draw too? So we have some, let me get you some more paper, because it looks like someone drew on this one, okay? Do you want to play with Play-Doh while I go get the paper?
I want to play with Play-Doh.
Huh?
I want to play with Play-Doh.
You want to play?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here you go. You want this one too? Just that one, okay.
This is right.
It looks like they mixed it, right?
Ready to put it in?
You can mix it. Mm-hmm.
About the results of that report, NYPD Chief of Detectives Robert Boyce said, quote, they determined during that time that there was not substantial injury to the child at all, and they returned the child to the mother, end quote. Zamir himself told ACS workers about his mother's boyfriend hitting him and forcing him to take cold showers as punishment. I never realized before starting my blog how horribly creative some abusive parents can be with their punishment. A.J. Friend's parents punished him with cold showers as well. In total, according to officials, ACS investigated Geraldine for abuse 5 times and had even substantiated some allegations, but nonetheless they inexplicably left Zymere in her care. After his kindergarten year, Zymere never returned to school. After Zymere's death, 5 ACS workers, including 2 supervisors, a manager, and 2 child care specialists, were placed temporarily on desk duty. 2 caseworkers were ultimately fired, and several others were disciplined. Zamir was mourned at a packed funeral at the Church of the Open Door in Brooklyn on Friday, October 7, 2016. The services were paid for in part by NYPD detectives who were strongly affected by Zymere's tragic death and raised over $9,000 to help pay for the wake and the funeral. One detective told the New York Post, quote, "It was the least we could do. The poor kid went through hell." End quote. He certainly did. At his funeral, Zamir, wearing a white suit and bow tie, lay in repose in a small, gold-trimmed, satin-lined white casket with the open top half draped with a white veil. A white teddy bear holding a red heart was propped by his head. Zamir was buried in the children's section of Rose Hill Cemetery in Linden, New Jersey.
He was joyful, playful. He used to run around, laugh, play. He loved his Superman and his Batman. He used to give you little wet kisses all the time. So, I mean, he was a great kid. Like, he was a normal kid. I knew him from the age from 4 to 5. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm disappointed. I have mixed feelings.
At Rysheim Smith's trial, which began in December of 2019 and spanned 4 weeks, Geraldine spent several consecutive days on the stand, testifying against him as part of a plea deal that allowed her to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter and receive only 2 to 6 years in prison in exchange for her testimony against her former boyfriend. Her 3 years of time served while waiting for the trial will be taken into account during sentencing. According to Geraldine's testimony, she and Zamir bounced from homeless shelter to homeless shelter. To make money to buy food, Geraldine resorted to sex work. Quote, "I'm a single parent. I'm a new parent. I didn't know how to raise him. I didn't know what I was doing." End quote. Geraldine admitted to the court that she abused her son when he was 3 years old while living in the shelter. She said, quote, "I would yell at him or I would beat him with a belt. He'd cry." End quote. She testified that a counselor at the shelter saw the abuse and warned her that any further instances would lead to her being reported. She said, quote, "That was the last time until I met Rysheim." End quote. Geraldine underwent mandatory parenting classes while living at the shelter, but despite these, she beat Zamir while living with her grandmother, who promptly kicked her out of the house. She also said at trial, quote, "Maybe I didn't pick up on the lessons they were giving me. I didn't cherish it. I didn't hold on to those lessons they taught me. Sometimes I wouldn't be bothered with him because I didn't have the energy or because I was too tired." End quote.
Both. So he was active in both. Yeah. What was it like raising a very active young boy? It was hard. What about it was hard for you? I mean, I'm a single parent. I'm new to it. I really didn't know how to raise him. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought you said that you were taking parenting classes, but honestly. I was, but it didn't work for me. Meaning, I didn't pick up on the lessons that they were giving me. I didn't cherish it. I didn't hold on to those lessons that they taught me. What kinds of things did they try to teach?
Geraldine told the jury she used a belt to punish Zamir because her hands weren't healthy due to lupus, so severe it occasionally landed her in the hospital, and she didn't want to hurt herself. Of Rysheim, Geraldine testified that the beginning of their relationship was wonderful. The older man brought her flowers and gifts. Quote, "It was magical. He was like my Prince Charming. I never experienced a man bringing me flowers like he did every day. He'd pick me up and take me to the park. We'd go to restaurants together. He was good to my child in the beginning, end quote. She testified at trial, quote, he was a father figure for my child. Rysheim played with him. He cut his hair most of the time. He bought toys for him. He read the Bible to him, end quote. This meant a lot to her because she had lost contact with Zymere's biological father shortly after the boy's birth. Once she and Zymere had moved into Rysheim's apartment, the man immediately began abusing little Zymere, who was 5 at the time. Geraldine said, quote, Rysheim would hold him in the shower by the shirt. He'd be screaming, moving around, trying to get away from the water, end quote. In June of 2015, according to a report released by ACS in December of 2016, an anonymous individual reported seeing Rysheim abusing Zymere in a public park. The witness described seeing Rysheim, quote, hit Zymere with excessive force at least 20 times on his buttocks and legs for not listening while at a picnic, end quote, and that Geraldine was present and did not intervene. Quote, the report also noted that Mr. Smith hit the child hard enough that the source sitting at the picnic table was able to hear the slaps from each hit, end quote. Geraldine told the court about an incident on July 4th, 2015, when the trio attended a family barbecue. Zymere, she said, pulled some plants out of a relative's garden, which cost Rysheim $100 to replace. The boy's punishment was one they used frequently. They deprived him of food. He was also ordered to hold a push-up position for an extended length of time, but after a few minutes, Zymere collapsed, exhausted. This, Geraldine said, enraged Rysheim, who hit the boy with a stick, punched him, and kicked him. Angry about the cost to replace the plants, Rysheim tormented little Zymere for hours. He even forced the boy to stand in a corner overnight, wide awake, while Geraldine supervised him to ensure he stayed awake. In October of 2015, Rysheim became angry with Zymere after the boy got in trouble at school for asking to see another boy's penis. Seeing this as a sign of homosexuality, which disgusted him, Rysheim punched Zymere in the jaw, knocking out one of the little boy's teeth. Just a side note here, that detail reminded me a little too much of the case of Gabriel Fernandez, whose life of torture and horrific death at the hands of his mother and her boyfriend in 2013 are the subject of a docuseries released on Netflix last week. In Gabriel's case, the mom's boyfriend suspected the 8-year-old boy of being gay as well and used that as an excuse to torment him and abuse him. There's another thing I've learned over the last several years. Not only are these abusive monsters creative in their methods of punishment, but they're also awfully innovative when it comes to their reasons. Anyway, Geraldine testified that Zymere begged her, quote, Mommy, I want to go home, end quote. She also said, quote, I'd just ignore it because I was in love with Rysheim and I felt in some way he must be right, end quote. Likely due to injuries he received at home, Zymere missed 36 days of class between September and November of 2015, even though the apartment where he lived with his mother and her boyfriend was only a block away from the school. The horrifying abuse, thinly disguised as discipline meted out by Rysheim and Geraldine, included forcing Zymere to skip meals, take cold showers, hold a plank position, and stand all night without sleeping. Because of the never-ending abuse, Geraldine testified, Zymere frequently wet and soiled himself, which further angered Rysheim, whose abuse then intensified in the worst kind of vicious circle. Assistant District Attorney Carrie O'Connell told jurors early in the trial about how uncomfortable and unpleasant Zymere's life was while living in that squalid apartment, where feces was embedded in the carpet, which was crawling with maggots. During testimony from NYPD Lieutenant Crinella Launis, the jurors were shown a video captured by the NYPD after Rysheim's arrest and portrays a filthy apartment. The stove is disgusting, the counters cluttered with dirty dishes. The dining room table is littered with prescription pill bottles and other junk. There's random debris strewn all over the floor, including suitcases, shoes, piles and piles of clothing, and a white bucket containing some murky, unidentifiable brown liquid. There are no toys visible anywhere that I could see. The bathroom is utterly disgusting, with brown stains in the sink, no lid on the toilet tank, and swelling and buckling from water damage on the ceiling. The bottom of the bathtub is covered with what looks to be a brown, gritty substance. In the rest of the apartment, towels and blankets are used for curtains. The bedrooms are so full of trash and piles of clothing that the floor is almost invisible, and the mattresses on the beds are bare besides the junk piled on top of them. A splintered chair leg protrudes from beneath one bed, bringing to mind the shattered broom handle police took into evidence after Zymere's death. The details that emerged about Zymere's last hours were beyond horrifying. Geraldine testified that by the evening of September 25, 2016, Zymere had spent about 24 hours without food or water as punishment for some perceived misbehavior, which she couldn't even remember on the stand. That evening, she and Rysheim stuffed their smug faces with Chinese takeout in front of the starving child. It's hard to keep my anger under control. Every detail of this case is more infuriating than the last. Zamir went to sleep that night on the living room floor, hungry and alone, despite there being at least 2 beds in the home that were unused. Hours later, she said, quote, "I heard him walking and going into the garbage bag, eating out of it. I thought it was a mouse," end quote. She chastised her son, grabbed the garbage bag away from him, and went back to bed. She awoke the next morning to the sound of Rysheim yelling at Zamir for defecating in the living room and trying to hide it. She testified to hearing him say, quote, "Why the fuck did you take a shit? Why did you take a fucking shit in here? There's a bathroom. You could have used the bathroom," end quote. She ran into the room to find the enormous man standing over her cowering son, cursing and poking the boy in the stomach with the jagged end of a broken broomstick. She told the court, quote, "He started to strike him with the broomstick, beating him from his chest to his legs with the broomstick," end quote. Geraldine testified that during the vicious attack, Zamir simply lay there, shaking and silent, his shirt and underwear smeared with feces. O'Connell asked Geraldine if she thought such a beating was warranted, to which Geraldine answered that she felt he was wrong for doing that in the living room. She theorized he had defecated in the living room because the apartment had no electricity, and he was afraid to walk to the bathroom in the dark by himself. This is a little 6-year-old boy we're talking about. Of course he was afraid of the dark, especially with such monsters living in the same apartment with him. How completely heartbreaking. At one point during the beating, Rysheim held Zamir in the air like a rag doll while he beat the helpless little boy with the broomstick, ranting and screaming that he could smell feces. Geraldine then watched Rysheim carry her screaming son into the bathroom, where the huge man forced the emaciated little boy into the grungy bathtub and waterboarded him, before yanking down the shower rod and beating Zamir about the head with it. Geraldine described the scene to the court, quote, "He was going limp, like unresponsive. I figured he was just faking," end quote. And why the actual fuck would she make that assumption? Well, according to Geraldine, Zamir had used similar tactics in the past, pretending to be unconscious so Rysheim would stop beating him. So they thought nothing of it when Rysheim hit Zamir in the back and the boy didn't respond. Just imagine the pain and fear that little boy must have felt for the instinct to kick in, to play dead. After the savage attack, Rysheim then hung the unconscious Zamir, still wearing his filthy and now wet and blood-soaked t-shirt and underwear, on a hook on the back of the bathroom door. Let me reiterate that. The monster hung the little boy from a hook on the bathroom door. Geraldine testified that when she later took Zamir down, Rysheim threw his limp body into one of the bedrooms, where he fell between a wall and the bed. He looked, Geraldine said, like he was dead. That's because he was. After Rysheim left the house to get them breakfast, Geraldine cleaned up the apartment, including the living room and the bedroom where Zamir's body lay, and read her Bible. She said at one point she tried to revive Zamir with a bath, and then with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and chest compressions, but neither worked. She testified that she instinctively knew Zamir was dead. Well, it's great that some of her instinct kicked in, but not the instinct to protect her son. The prosecution wondered what was she thinking at that point. She replied, quote, "That my baby is dead and I'm going to be in jail and I'm in a lot of trouble," end quote. So let me get this straight. Her 6-year-old son was dead, beaten to death by her boyfriend, and her main worry was herself. Her lack of empathy for her own child sends chills down my spine. Hours later, when Rysheim returned to the apartment, he told Geraldine to take Zamir out the back door of the apartment building and to lie if anyone asked where she came from. He wanted her to tell anyone who asked that Zamir had come down with food poisoning at a homeless shelter, and to tell no one about the Harlem apartment where he was illegally squatting. Geraldine told the court before she took Zymere and left, she took about 10 minutes to put on a wig and some makeup. Quote, "I'm very self-conscious about how I look outside," end quote. "If you need to pause here and take a few deep breaths, maybe grab a glass of wine, I totally understand. I'm thinking about doing it myself." I would love for all of you to go take a look at the Facebook photo album that I posted to go along with this case and tell me how amazing Geraldine looks in her wig. Anyway, Geraldine carried Zymere bridal style out of the building, where a passerby helped her hail a taxi, which took her and Zymere to Manhattan's Mount Sinai St. Luke's Hospital. Several people witnessed the awful scene and spoke to reporters about it.
It will forever be with me in my mind. His lifeless little body, you know. It was so scary, so sad. When I put his shirt up to try to maybe see where we could do try to resuscitate him, I see all the bruises.
The main question is, what happened in that apartment? What was y'all doing to that kid?
ACS been in here numerous times. Like, for myself, I've seen him 3 times. 3 times myself.
But y'all let it go? No. That I didn't understand at all. That's what it gets me more angrier.
Jurors were shown security footage showing Geraldine wearing an orange sweater, tight blue jeans, brown boots, and her ever so gorgeous and not at all obvious wig, carrying Zymere's lifeless body, his arm dangling limply, into the hospital, where she reportedly told staff that her son fell out of his bed. At one point, she had to pause by the nurse's station to readjust her grip so she didn't drop him. A few moments later, she had handed her son off to a tall man in a blue checkered polo shirt and white pants, who rushed Zymere into an examination room and out of the camera's line of sight. The swarm of medical professionals who follow the boy into that room is a powerful visual. This was an all-hands-on-deck situation. During Rysheim's trial, ER nurse Michael Nelson testified about the moment when Geraldine carried Zymere's body into the hospital, screaming and carrying on. Quote, "He was extremely cold. I felt the coldness of him through his clothes. This child was dead for a while. There was no bringing this child back." End quote. A report from the New York State Office of Children and Family Services showed that Zymere may have been dead for up to 17 hours before his mother brought him to the hospital. If that's the case, that woman took a lot longer than 10 minutes to put on her precious wig. According to the New York Times, a doctor compared Zymere's injuries to those of someone who had been hit by a car. On Wednesday, January 20th, 2020, Rysheim Smith was found guilty of second-degree murder, individual counts of first- and second-degree manslaughter, and 2 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. Reporters present in the courtroom saw him shaking his head in disbelief as his lawyer, Arnold Levine from the Legal Aid Society, patted his back in consolation.
I'll say this is the first count of this indictment, charging the defendant, Rysheim Smith, with the crime of murder in the second degree. Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Rysheim is scheduled to be sentenced on March 27th, 2020. He faces anywhere from 15 years to life in prison. We can only hope he'll be sentenced to the longer end of that spectrum. Because of her plea deal, Geraldine was convicted of manslaughter and agreed to a prison sentence of 2 to 6 years, which is beyond disgusting and utterly infuriating. By the time she gets out of prison, she won't even be past her childbearing years yet. In a statement released on February 14th, 2017, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus R. Vance, Jr., after announcing Rysheim Smith's indictment, pleaded for others to take action. Quote, "I urge anyone who believes they know of a victim of child abuse to call our child abuse hotline at 212-335-4308 or visit the Manhattan Family Justice Center at 80 Center Street. Help is available for those in need regardless of immigration status." End quote. DA Vance released another statement after the conclusion of the trial in which he said, quote, "The death of Zamir Perkins was an unthinkable tragedy that sent shockwaves through the city and inspired a reckoning with how our social services system works to protect New York's most vulnerable." End quote. Children's Services Commissioner Gladys Carrion has resigned from her position over lingering concerns about her agency's handling of vulnerable children.
Losing a child is unbearable.
and it's my responsibility.
I'm anxious to hear our discussion on how we can make sure that no other children suffer such a similar fate.
We have to knit the safety net tighter and tighter and tighter so that there are no opportunities for children like Zamir to fall through any of those openings.
ACS has taken steps to improve preventive services for parents like Geraldine and to make investigations move more quickly. New lines of communication have been established between caseworkers, and school officials are now using attendance records to distinguish signs of possible abuse. School nurses in New York City are now trained to photograph injuries. At child advocacy centers like the one where Zamir was interviewed mere months before his death, the handling of cases like his has become better disciplined. ACS Commissioner Hansel said, quote, "We have learned a lot from the tragic fatality of Zamir Perkins, and we've striven to use it to strengthen all the components of our system." End quote. If you see something, say something. This phrase has echoed throughout the American lexicon since the terror attacks of September 11, 2001. It doesn't just apply to acts of terrorism or individuals suspected of such. Please, if you think you've witnessed child abuse or know a child who's being abused, tell someone. A child's life could depend on it. As John F. Kennedy said, quote, "There are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction." End quote. I'd like to end by remembering Zamir as the innocent, curious little boy he was. Little Zai loved Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. According to the program handed out at his funeral, he was known to be articulate, playful, and loving. The program also said, quote, "Zamir had a smile that would captivate anyone's heart," end quote. If you take a look at any of the few pictures available of Zamir online, there's no way you won't agree. I will provide a future update on the podcast and on the blog once Rysheim Smith is sentenced. In the meantime, cross all of your fingers that he gets a sufficiently lengthy sentence. And that's it for now, guys. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. It was extremely rough. Come back next week and I'll have another case for you. Please subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. You can also subscribe on YouTube by searching Suffer the Little Children Podcast. Visit the website at sufferthelittlecHildrenpod.com, where you can listen to episodes, leave a voicemail, and become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to exclusive show merch. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Tumblr at Suffer the Little Children Pod, and on Twitter at STLC Pod. I've posted a photo album for today's case on Facebook and Instagram. Email tips, comments, questions, or case suggestions to sufferthelittlechildren.pod@gmail.com. You can also read about today's case as well as many others at sufferthelittlechildrenblog.com. This podcast was written and produced by Laine. Music and sound effects for the show were created using sounds from audiojungle.com. Always remember, hug your babies a bit closer tonight. Until next week, bye guys.